I am Dr. Susan Nowak from Nazareth College. I am part of the Religious Studies Department. I am the holder of the William H. Shannon Chair in Catholic Studies, and I have had the honor of working with Dr. Shafiq from his coming to Nazareth to the present day. And it has indeed been an honor for me to work with such a respectful scholar. So, Dr. Timani. Dr. Timani is a professor of philosophy and religion. He is the co-director of the Middle East and North African Studies program at Christopher Newport University. His title for us is The Concept of al-Fana in Ibn Arabi's and Eckhart's thoughts. So he will be bringing together the thoughts of these two esteemed scholars. Dr. Timani.
Thank you, Dr. Nowak, for the introduction. Hello, everyone. Good morning, maybe my time in Virginia. My topic, al-Fana, and I find this, again, al-Fana means the annihilation of the many in the one. And I find it relevant with the virus today is that we are trying to annihilate that virus, and the less of it, the better. So I want to see how this can apply to our world today, especially to, again, interface dialogue. How can this help us in bringing everybody together, annihilating the many in the one. So again, the title is al-Fana in Ibn Arabi's and Eckhart thoughts, the annihilation of the many in the one. So I'm gonna go through the pages here and explain some concepts, ideas. So this paper discusses the mystical concept of al-Fana, or more, we can say the annihilation of the self, or the annihilation of the ego, in the thoughts of Muhyiddin ibn Arabi, who was a mystic philosopher, died in 1240, and also in the thoughts of the theologian, the mystic Meister Eckhart, German philosopher, died a century later after Ibn Arabi in 1328. This paper demonstrates that mystical traditions in both Islam and Christianity provide the theological models to transform the self and the world from ubudiyya. In Arabic, ubudiyya means slavehood, serving or worshiping other than God, to ubuda, meaning servitude, serving or worshiping one God. So this paper argues that the concept of al-Fana, the annihilation, is a theological paradigm that helps the individual make the flight from the own ego to God. So this flight towards God is the transformation of the self, the individual, into a new human being who accepts the other as the self. And again, when I say this flight towards God, it doesn't have to be only literal. It has, again, what we mean is that the flight from our own ego to the benefit of the whole, rather than the benefit of the individual. So Ibn Arabi is selected for this project. So why Ibn Arabi? Because his definition of al-Fana is more compatible with the Islamic doctrine of Tawheed, or the oneness of God, vis-a-vis other Sufis or other mystics, Muslim mystics, whose understanding of the concept reveals a more pantheistic nature. Eckhart, the German philosopher, also selected because his philosophy and his approach to al-Fana contributes to our understanding of the concept, as well as it helps us better understand Ibn Arabi's Fana. For Eckhart's thought on mysticism were very likely inspired and influenced by Ibn Arabi. All right, so mystical traditions have theological paradigms that call believers to think of the divine as an absolute reality beyond the possibilities of human conceptions, in Arabic tanzih, which means God is beyond our conception. Plato, the Greek philosopher, making the distinction between the absolute reality and the human conception, argues that this world is a single unity made up of one reality, which is being hidden by the world of diversity. In the words of Jonathan Sacks, quote, "Truth is the same for everyone, everywhere. When we reach this level of exploring God in the other, we attain the knowledge of the divine that we are seeking through annihilative transformation." The importance of this paper lies in its interreligious comparative theological approach, as it discusses the concept of al-Fana in both Christianity and Islam, and it introduces a new paradigm in the fields of comparative theology and interreligious interfaith studies. So this paper builds on the work of Sayfuddin al-Mirzana, who engaged the mystical thoughts of both Ibn Arabi and Eckhart towards a new matrix for Christian-Muslim dialogue. So the new paradigm lies at the intersection of mysticism and interreligious studies in both Christianity and Islam. The few scholars who have explored interreligious studies in both Christianity and Islam have done so from a theological and scriptural approach. For instance, these scholars have used religious foundations like theological views on the nature of God, textual claims, scriptural reasoning, and historical events to construct interfaith theologies in both traditions. This paper departs from this mainstream Orthodox approach and rather applies a more esoteric and theosophical understanding of how Christianity and Islam can come together in the age of globalization. The mystical writings of the most prominent mystical philosophers in both traditions, like Ibn Arabi and Eckhart, are used to arrive to the common word in both Christianity and Islam. To discuss the concept of al-Fana in Ibn Arabi's thought. The source of Fana, or the Fana concept in Ibn Arabi's thought, is rooted in the most important doctrine in Islam, which is the Tawheed, the oneness of God. Tawheed in mystical Islam, according to Sayyid Hussein Nasr, is the integration of man in all depths and breadths of his existence. Quote. So it is the integration of man with the whole universe, of man with other man, of man with God, of the other with the self. It is the union and the integration of the many with the one. Also, what lies at the heart of Sufism or Islamic Gnosis, Irfan, is the doctrine of the transcendent unity of being, or wahdat al-wujud, which means the oneness of everything. So the source of this doctrine, according to Nasr, is an experience of the unity of being, an experience which can enable man to transcend the world of multiplicity and to reach the stations of annihilation, fana, and then the remaining or subsistence, baqa. So from annihilation to remaining somewhere, wherein he gains vision of the ultimate oneness of all things in their transcendent origin. So for Ibn Arabi, wahdat al-wujud, or the oneness of being, is the oneness or unity of finding. What this implies is that the search for God as other does not entail a discovery of an irresolvable dichotomy between the creation and the creator, but rather a discovery that all of creation is a stunning manifestation of the oneness of the divine being that ultimately admits no duality. And the oneness of all things does not negate the many. Rather, it projects, embraces, encompasses, penetrates, and reintegrates the many. Therefore, in regard to humankind, all humans are one in their humanity. For humanity is the defining reality of each human soul. Because, as the Quran tells us, all souls were created from a single soul, Quran 31:28. And whoever kills an innocent life, it is as if he had killed all humankind. And whoever saves a life, it is as if he had saved all humankind, Quran 5:32. So in the esoteric, Gnostic, or Sufi tradition, Tawheed, the oneness of being, eliminates the gap or boundary between the creator and creatures, self and others, and being and nothingness. Ibn Arabi sees al-Fana as the merging and the annihilation of the individual essence in its one being in a kind of presence that asserts the unity of being resulting from God's manifestation. All material and spiritual existences are nothing but the manifestations of God's name and attributes. Al-Fana for Ibn Arabi is the annihilation of the world's particular things in the oneness of the divine. The divine essence is one, and Al-Fana is the experience the Gnostic go through as a step towards realizing this truth. Al-Fana in Ibn Arabi's thought means that the Gnostic is unaware of anything except one single truth. Only the Gnostic is aware of this reality, while the masses become aware of it after death. So Al-Fana is a kind of absence accompanied by uncovering and witnessing. It is a knowledge whose purpose is to pass away, Fana, from seeing the many rather than the annihilation of the many. All right, so the annihilation, which means you don't see it anymore, rather than the annihilation of the diversity. So God's manifestation in all things results from the divine's longing to his servant, the same way the servant longs for his God. The passion and longing to meeting the divine is a reality existing continuously because the truth is always apparent in the Creator's existence. Ibn Arabi tells us that the divine reality transcends the realm of perception. It is the unseen. If created things cease to be seen, then they pass to the state of non-existence, al-Fana, but they remain in the eternal. The many will now exist in the one, and the hierarchical order of the things will achieve its union with the one. At this stage, the hierarchy of things becomes one with only one name attached to it. In the one, all things cease to exist, and what remains is God's essence. Put it more clearly, Ibn Arabi writes that while Ahad or one refers to divine essence, the many names attributed to him makes it easier for the human mind to comprehend the divine. This essence is not dependent on the attributes, just as it is not dependent on God's creation. So Ibn Arabi tells us that as all things return to the divine, where their existence becomes a divine existence, all things emerge from him and can be traced to him. All things belong to him, both its beginning and end. All matters will be returned to him just as they began from him. So Ibn Arabi explains al-Fana as a state of union with God, which is debarred to those preoccupied with their own self-centeredness. It ensures the perishing of one's personal ego and its mystical survival within God's being. The following lines of Ibn Arabi's poetry explain the concept of al-Fana. He says, "If I perish, I exist no longer, and if I remain, I exist no longer. All of us are meant to be for all of us, and all of us emerged from the divine decree of exist. If you say I am one, you are telling the truth. And if you say we are not one, you have not told a lie." So that's those lines of poetry as I see it best describe al-Fana. All right, so these lines by Ibn Arabi serve as a reminder that people of diverse backgrounds are one in their humanity. No religion, ethnicity, or race is at the center, and no one is at the margin. Either all are at the center, or all are at the margin. For Ibn Arabi, the relationship between God and the existent represents unity rather than separation or dualism. This relationship, which is known as the unity of being, compels the Gnostic to search and inquire about the secrets of the existence that it was created for. Ibn Arabi warns against a unity of being composed of both God's essence and human essence. For God does not resemble anything and cannot be compared to anything. The unity of being is the acknowledgement that God is incomparable. So this definition of al-Fana was also echoed by Eckhart a century later, which I will move to discuss in the next paragraphs. So like Ibn Arabi, a century before, Eckhart echoes the concept of al-Fana in his sermons as he affirms wahdat al-wujud, or the oneness of all of being, of God and all beings. So the oneness of everything. Eckhart says that we are the same being with God. In this life, all things are one. They are all together in all, and all united in all. So again, this is a quote from Eckhart. So all the parts in the body, he points out, are united in such a way that the eye belongs to the foot, and the foot to the eye. If the foot could speak, it would say, I am the eye, and the eye in turn would say the same thing. Eckhart adds, all the grace in Mary belongs equally and even more properly to the angel, although it is in Mary. And all that is in Mary belongs to the saint and is even more his own. What someone possesses in the beyond, another possesses equally, not as acquired from him or taken from him, but as dwelling in himself, so that the grace which is in the one is fully also in the other, exactly as one's own grace. Eckhart says that we possess an identity identical to God that makes us see him in his divinity. He adds that we are the identical being and the identical substance and nature that he is himself. God makes us know himself by his act of knowing. For him to make us know and for us to know are one and the same thing. Hence, according to Eckhart, his knowledge is ours. God's knowledge is ours. Since God's knowledge is ours, and since his substance is his knowledge, his nature and his being, it follows that his being, his substance, and his nature are ours. So the concept of al-Fana in Eckhart's thought is clearly expressed in the following. Since it is God's nature not to be like anyone, then we are nothing, so we become him. When we cease seeing ourselves in any form, when no form is imprinted in us, and when we expel whatever is in us, then we pass away into God, al-Fana into God, annihilation into God. Then we are translated into God and we become one with him. One soul, substance, one being, and one nature. Then we become all things as he is, and we are one and the same being with him. For man to become one with God, all inadequacies must be eradicated. Only then may we be all in all, as God is all in all. All right, so I'm gonna check, see if my time. So again, a little bit more about, I don't wanna expand on the concept of Fana in Eckhart, because we get the idea how he and Ibn Arabi agrees that everything is one in the oneness of being. So now I want to move to talk about what does this mean to us today and how can we create a theology based on this idea al-Fana. So in the age of globalization, the theology of al-Fana is a necessary theology to narrow the gap or dismantle the boundaries, not only between religions and religious communities, but also between the global north and the global south, between the rich and the poor, between those who are empowered and those who are oppressed. Because all humans, with all their diversity, belong to the same reality. Enslaving one person is equal to the enslavement of all humankind. Radical capitalism must be met by radical monotheism, like the concept of al-Fana, to create a balance between two forms of extremes. The theology of al-Fana rejects arrogance and boastfulness because they are traits that lead not only to tyranny, injustice, and oppression, but also to the destruction of the self as well as the other. Therefore, the integration of man with other man, of man with the whole universe, of man with God, of the other with the self, leads to absolute nothingness, a state in which arrogance, boastfulness, and egoism are destroyed. The concept of al-Fana eliminates all forms of injustice because mysticism, as Walter Stace points out, is the apprehension of an ultimate non-sensuous unity in all things, a oneness or a one to which neither the senses nor the reason can penetrate. So the non-sensuous unity of all things where neither the senses nor the reason can penetrate is the Fana of the empirical selfhood, when the ego consciousness is completely dissolved into the consciousness of reality, or rather consciousness which is reality. So in a world where egoism drives our appetites and desires and prevents us from caring for the poor and the oppressed, where our selfhood demands from us to care less about our neighbor, to shun the immigrant and the stranger, and to look down at those who look different, the fana of our ego into the consciousness of reality becomes necessary. So fana is man's experiencing the total annihilation of his own ego and consequently of all things that have been related to the ego in the capacity of its objects of cognition and volition. Fana is the ontological stage of unification or gathering, when the essential demarcations separating one thing from another are no longer here, and when multiplicity is no longer observable. Fana thus can be achieved, as Toshihiko Izutsu points out, when there is no ego consciousness left. Abdurrahman Jami, a famous Iranian poet philosopher of the 15th century, says, quote, "Keep yourself away from your own ego and set your mind free from the vision of others." The end of quote. So globalization can be transformed into a positive force if egotism disappears in the experience of al-Fana. Thus, a theology of al-Fana or Fana al-Ana, the annihilation of the ego, is a necessary theology for the promotion of justice in the age of globalization. So based on the unitive model expressed in al-Fana, globalization should cease to be a one-way mobility with a center. Striving for a social unity, the center is everywhere or nowhere. The implication this has in the age of globalization would be the realization of steps that Christians and Muslims can take in order to transform their theological views into much needed service in the contemporary world. This is how globalization can become a process that brings about social and economic justice for all and moral renewal, and thus become a liberating factor that generates unity and hope. So the 21st century is the century not only of interfaith dialogue and mutual understanding, but also of transformation. Critics see in transformation an alterity, a change in theology, a compromise, or a threat to the status quo. But this is not really what we're looking for here. For Christians and Muslims who believe that interreligious activism is needed to face the challenges of globalization, transformation then becomes a solution rather than a problem. If we believe in transformation and if we are honest about the transformation of the self, then our theological views can help us bring peace, justice, freedom, and equality to the millions of people who are suffering today in the age of liberal economy. So the journey to God requires a transformation of the self, regardless of the many paths in this journey. To transform the self is to seek a new path while maintaining, but not abandoning, the performance of orthodox rites. The transformation of the self allows us two encounters, the encounter with the ineffable and two, the encounter with the other. So the transformation of the self materializes only when the seeker of transformation, as Ibn Arabi tells us, quote, empties his heart of reflective, speculative thoughts, and when he sits in poverty, having nothing at the door of his Lord, then God will bestow upon him and give him something of knowledge of him. End of quote. So the transformation of the self bestows upon us the knowledge that brings us closer to the divine and to the other, only by distancing ourselves from our ego. It frees us from all that might distract us from our encounters with divinity and human dignity. So both Christianity and Islam call the believers to a transformation of the self, a transformation into new beings that are detached from their own egotism. The detachment from our own ego, or the emptying of the self, which means al-Fana, al-Ana, bring us closer to the actual meaning of divine truth. The transformation of the soul to reflect the imago Dei, divine image, provides a path to conquer the other, the self-divide that we created by conceptualizing the divine in human terms. The unity of being is a theological paradigm that calls the believers to think of the divine as an absolute reality beyond the possibilities of human conception or tanzih. So the seeker of an annihilative transformation, fana, renouncing everything other than God, in Eckhart's and Ibn Arabi's thought, is the flight to God, a flight not from one thing towards another, since there is nothing other than God. So in the age of globalization, we separated God from his creation and made the flight from God to worldly things.
Dr.
al-Fana,
Timani, just
yes,
1 minute.
I'm almost there. So al-Fana reminds us that the impossibilities of thinking of God in human terms and serve as theological models for the transformation of the self. All right, so again, in conclusion, this paper, I explored the concept of al-Fana in both Christianity and Islam from the perspective of two prominent figures like Ibn Arabi and Eckhart. And both these mystics, they stress on the unity of being and the annihilation of man and the world in God. So their concept of al-Fana contribute to our understanding of what it means to come together in our diversity as a unity. And this paper has also demonstrated that applying the concept of al-Fana serves as a new paradigm to approach the field of interreligious interfaith studies and Christian-Muslim relations. Al-Fana was chosen for this paper because it is a shared concept in mystical Christianity and Islam that highlights the unity of the diversity and speaks to the importance on focusing on our shared humanity. It is the hope that this paper will serve as a model for future projects on the concept of al-Fana in particular and mystical philosophy in general to enrich our understanding of our shared humanity and help us reflect on the common word in both traditions. It is also the hope that further studies will continue to explore the concept of al-Fana across religious traditions around the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right, thanks.
Very much appreciated. And I look forward to the question answer because I was jotting down ideas as you were speaking.
All right, I'm in trouble then.
So now we turn to Dr. Thomas Katoy. Yes.
I said yes, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, okay, yes, good. Who obviously is eager, and we are eager to hear you, Dr. Katoy. Dr. Cattoi is an associate professor of Christology and cultures at the Jesuit School of Theology at Santa Clara University in Berkeley, California. His presentation today is towards an interreligious lectiodivina, an allegorical approach to spiritual hermeneutics in early Christianity and Tibetan Buddhism.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're
and
welcome.
I shared my screen here. I have just a few basic points that I want you to see. And while you were talking, Professor Timani, I actually realized that I have an icon of Maximus the Confessor right here. So at least you can see what he supposedly looked like just behind me. So my question is, how should we approach a sacred text? How many different interpretations can a particular text sustain? And even more intriguingly, can the interpretation of a sacred text change over time? The purpose of this paper is to cast light on some of these questions and reflect on the nature and purpose of the exegesis of a sacred text in the broader context of spiritual practice. So I'm going to compare and contrast the approach to scriptural hermeneutics developed by the Byzantine author Maximus the Confessor, whom you've just seen, who lived between 580 and 662, and the strategies of textual hermeneutics articulated by the Tibetan master Tsongkhapa, who lived between 1357 and 1419. And I understand most of you will not be familiar with these figures, but I can at least tell you that Tsongkhapa plays the same role within the Tibetan Buddhist tradition that, let's say, Thomas Aquinas plays within the Roman Catholic tradition. So he's extraordinarily influential, and his study is really central to the training of Tibetan Buddhist monks. So this essay will bring into conversation these two distinct approaches to Lectio Divina, highlighting some points of contact as well as a number of irreducible differences between their two approaches. The comparison will help us gain a deeper appreciation of the way sacred texts function within different religious traditions, with a special attention to the role of allegorical interpretations in the context of spiritual practice. Now, many of you will be familiar with the Philokalia, which is an anthology of theological and spiritual writings from the Christian East, writings written between the 4th and the 15th century, but the anthology was published in the 18th century. And the compilers of this work did not include works of specific authors in their entirety, but they often just chose to include passages that are relevant to the challenges and the demands of monastic practice. So if you look at what they did with Maximus the Confessor, who really covers most of the second volume of the Philokalia, you see that you find a work called The Various Texts on Theology, the Divine Economy, and Virtue and Vice. And these writings were not actually really penned by Maximus the Confessor in this form, but they are a collage. And the compilers of the Philokalia chose this text because they really try to give you an overview of what Maximus the Confessor is actually trying to do with text. Let me go to the next page here. Now, Maximus' exegetical vision is marked by a strong belief in the unity of the Old and the New Testament as a coherent witness of God's salvific plan, rooted in the mystery of the divine economy. For instance, Origen, authors from the pre-Nicene period, who were writing at a time when no scriptural canon had really been established, really faced the challenge. How can we actually establish scriptural continuity between the Old Testament and the writings that eventually would come to compose the New Testament? Given the fact that in the Old Testament you have this very strong emphasis on monotheism, or at least henotheism, but whereas in the New Testament you have all these different intimations or suggestions of divine plurality. The way forward towards the creation of a coherent hermeneutics that actually enables us to sort of grasp the whole of scriptural revelation as one is actually by way of spiritual practice. So the core sort of pivot behind scriptural hermeneutics is the diligent practice of the virtues, as Maximus says in the 5th century of various texts. Now, the relationship between the practice of the virtues and the purification of the intellect and the interpretation of scripture is something that Maximus actually discusses at great length in a number of works. So the opening statement of Maximus's 5th century is what you see here. Through the diligent practice of the virtues, the natural intelligence is raised towards the intellect. Virtue is stable and utterly dispassionate, and it leads apathetikos, and it leads to a state of righteousness. So Maximus actually distinguishes 3 different laws that we can actually find in the scriptures. One is a natural law, which is operative whenever the intellect is not controlled by the senses. One is the written law, which turns natural disposition towards goodness into a habit. So it takes longer to get there. And then you have a law of grace, which calls us to imitate God and actually reach deification. And something I wasn't thinking about, but after listening to your paper, Professor Timani, it occurred to me that, one of the themes that are very important for Maximus the Confessor is the theme of moving away from philautia towards agape. So philautia really means self-centeredness. The goal of spiritual practice is a kind of gradual process of unselfing, decentering the self, so that you actually leave place for God's grace to actually come in. So you don't eliminate the self entirely, because the self is always going to be there, but the self is no longer at the center of your own practice. Now, after introducing the distinction between 3 different laws, Maximus tells us, using a language that would not be out of place in a Buddhist treatise, that the things men value lack being. They only seem to exist because of mistaken judgments, but they have no principle of existence at all. So as the diligent cultivation of the virtue sweeps away the passions from the intellect turns into a pure, resplendent mirror. And then it can receive knowledge of divine things. Our intellect is in fact said to be formless and without any specific quality of expression, but its form instead is either acquired through the ignorance caused by the passions or through the knowledge brought by the virtues. And Maximus is going to talk about 2 more levels within the divine law. One is a literal meaning, which steers away from the passions, and the other one is a spiritual meaning, which guides us towards the knowledge of the divine mystery. Origen appears to distinguish 3 levels of interpretation: the literal, the tropological or moral, and the pneumatic, and Maximus seems to blend the first two. Many of you will be familiar, for instance, to just give you an example, for instance, if you think of the passage that details the Hebrews' departure from Egypt and the passage through the Red Sea, the literal meaning is obviously a chronicle of this particular event. The ethical meaning is supposed to point at a move away from the land of sin to the land of grace through the water of baptism. And the spiritual meaning, well, actually there is a variety of spiritual meaning that you can give to this particular text, but one of them would be, for instance, the move from this world to the next at the eschaton. You know, there is a whole variety of different ways in which you can actually read the text. And for Maximus, turning away from the literal to the spiritual meaning entails a process of intellectual and spiritual purification. You know, and it's very interesting, if you read the Philokalia, you will find endless examples of this particular multi-layered approach to the text in ways that, you know, an adherent perhaps of the historical critical method might find puzzling or problematic, because a contemporary reader of the text could start asking questions, let's say, about authorial intentionality. Did the author really mean that when he, and usually it's a he, alas, not really a she, when he actually wrote this text? But the authors of the Philokalia, like Maximus the Confessor, really operate with a very different understanding of the purpose of the text. And rather than focusing on the intentionality between the text, they focus on the reception of the text. In what way can the text can be received by different readers? And more advanced readers will receive the text in a way that is very different from the readers that are still somehow ensnared by their own passions. Well, I'm not going to give you more examples, but we can later on if we have time. The problem is, Maximus says that, you see, on one hand, yes, we have to move through these different stages of interpretations in the text. But even if you just remain stuck at the ethical level, which is already higher than the literal level, you're still betraying the spirit of the text, because you're not actually able to move to the spiritual implication of the text. And this is really the major problem of textual supersessionism that Maximus the Confessor and Origen were really struggling with. What do we do with the literal meaning of the text once we have come to a consensus that the spiritual meaning actually is the ultimate purpose of the text? And both Maximus and Origen are really critiqued, even by authors of their time, Origen perhaps more so than Maximus, because people started to wonder whether they actually really believed in the literal meaning of the text. People said that Origen believed in a Galilea of the mind, and that Christ had only really become incarnate in your own intellect or in your own nous. And Origen strongly insists that, in fact, every particular spiritual meaning is actually grounded in the literal meaning of the text. So the literal meaning always provides an anchor, while the spiritual meaning can go in different directions. And Maximus the Confessor will actually do something very similar and say that while we can have an infinite number of spiritual meanings derived from a particular text, because there is going to be an infinite number of readers, the literal meaning always serves as a sort of container within which all the different spiritual meanings actually function. Now, let me perhaps skip something here. Now, and of course, you know, what happens is that, you know, we have to determine what is the basis of this kind of hermeneutic jump from the literal to the spiritual meaning. And while the reconfiguration of interiority under the leadership of the intellect is always foregrounded by Maximus in his writings, in the vision of the Philokalia, this kind of approach is always outlined in a very Christological, Christocentric, even Christomorphic perspective. The incarnate Christ is presented as one instance of fully ordered humanity, where the passions are subordinate to the intellect and are able to serve their proper telos. So an engagement of the text of Scripture is the strategy of choice to discern how we are to follow Christ's example. Now, this approach to textual hermeneutics, of course, is not without its detractors. And, well, I already told you, what some people say, but especially contemporary scriptural scholars often resist the supersessionist thrust of these early interpreters, because, on one hand, the demotion of the Old Testament to a preparatory status is seen as theologically problematic, perpetuating the teaching of contempt towards Judaism that was condemned in the wake of the Second Vatican Council, Nostra Aetate, etc. On the other hand, the modern emphasis on authorial intentionality is at odds with this exegetical approach in particular. So, I mean, this, especially the first problem, the question of, the teaching of contempt is a very complex issue that cannot be addressed in detail in the context of this conversation. But it is important to remember that Maximus's exegetical claims are purely theological, seeking to develop a cogent rationale for inner development within a particular religious tradition. As such, in no way they can be used to develop an attitude of anti-Semitism. Now, if we move to the second of the two authors that I want to talk about today, who is Tsongkhapa. Tsongkhapa develops, well, I don't know how much background some of you might have, but his work as a thinker and monastic reformer comes at a very important juncture in the history of Tibetan Buddhism. So we're talking about 14th, early 15th century, although of course they were using very different chronologies. At the time there were significant disagreements between adherents of different lineages within the tradition. And Tsongkhapa was very committed to a school of thought known as Madhyamaka, which draws a distinction between a conventional reality and an ultimate reality. But first and foremost, before being a Madhyamaka practitioner, he was a Mahayana practitioner who emphasized the identity between samsara and nirvana. And Tsongkhapa also envisaged the awakened state as an active reality, or apratishthita nirvana, where bodhisattvas continue to aid sentient beings as they struggle to achieve liberation. Just very briefly, because in the older Theravada tradition, there is this tendency to sort of drive a wedge between samsara and nirvana, so that once you achieve nirvana, eventually you're just gone. Samsara and nirvana are ontologically distinct. Here they are one. It's just that nirvana is covered by defilements and ignorance, so you're not aware of it. You're not aware of the fact that you're always in nirvana from the very beginning. Now, and this is very important because if you look at some of the literature from the 1950s or 60s, there is a tendency to read the distinction between samsara and nirvana, even in these Tibetan authors, in Platonic terms, as if we have an inferior samsaric world and then you have a world of ideas like nirvana somewhere else. It's really not like that. What we have are two different perspectives on the same reality. The samsaric perspective is entangled in a net of causes and effect, codependent origination, whereas the nirvanic perspective views the world of causes and effect as a tool to achieve awakening. And what is distinctive about Tsongkhapa's approach is that his goal is not the goal of practice for Tsongkhapa is not just to achieve enlightenment for yourself, but for everyone who is mired in samsara. Now, see, as I already told you, you can see that Tsongkhapa's understanding of awakening and samsara and nirvana are distinct from earlier understanding of awakening and samsara and nirvana. So what is Tsongkhapa going to do? He wants to emphasize his continuity with the earlier tradition and the earlier understanding of samsara and nirvana, and yet at the same time he wants to underscore the normativity of his own approach, the fact that there is progress. So as you can see, he's facing a similar problem to that faced by some of these early Greek fathers who somehow had to do something with the Old Testament, which was the basis of their own vision, but somehow was superseded in their own understanding by a new level of revelation. In a text known as the Lekshe Nyingpo, which is the essence of true eloquence, Tsongkhapa, well, he addresses a lot of issues, but this is one of the themes that he actually addresses. And he writes this book because he wants to convince his audience that Madhyamaka thought is not nihilistic or antinomian. If everything is empty, are moral rules still of any value? Why should we actually really do anything if anything is empty? If everything is empty, how can we still believe that certain events can actually cause other events? So some opponents of this approach thought that actually really emphasizing that everything is empty leads to ethical, justifies immorality, because you can just kind of do anything in the end. Some disciples of the Buddha apparently went and asked him, can we put our hands into a brood of vipers if everything is empty? And the Buddha said, yes, try. And then they went and they got bitten and they died. Hopefully this is apocryphal. But the idea is that causes and effect continue to function even if everything is empty. What Tsongkhapa decides to do is to distinguish between two different levels of textual interpretation. And he distinguishes between Nitartha texts and Neyartha texts. A Nitartha text is a text which is definitive, or according to Kamalashila, a text that is explained logically in terms of the ultimate. And the Neyartha text is a text that is interpretable or has to be led, as the ultimate meaning has to be extracted, so to speak, from the conventional meaning. And Nitartha is a past participle and Neyartha is a gerundive. So, in a way, Nitartha seems to imply that, well, everything that can be said about this text has already been said, whereas Neyartha suggests that the meaning still has to be taken out from this particular text. So I'm simplifying a lot here, but for Tsongkhapa in general, all texts that precede his particular understanding of Madhyamaka philosophy should be regarded as Neyartha texts, because they are not yet, they have not yet really reached this kind of level of speculative understanding of the fundamental teachings of the Buddha. Whereas the teachings that reflect his own understanding of Madhyamaka, which is, by the way, called Prasangika Madhyamaka, are actually Nitartha texts, texts that are definitive. And the idea is that, you can use a Nitartha text to interpret a Neyartha text, but not vice versa. And I told you earlier that, the question is, well, what is the kind of conceptual pivot that these early Greek fathers used to conceptualize the rationale for their hermeneutic jump from one level to the next? And I told you that's Christology. Well, here is, for Tsongkhapa, obviously the pivot is his own specific understanding of emptiness. So if a text reflects his own specific understanding of emptiness, it's an Nitartha text. If a text has not yet reached this particular understanding of emptiness, it's a Neyartha text. Now, thanks to, there is a notion in Mahayana Buddhism known as skillful means. You can see here, Upaya Kaushalya. And essentially that says that earlier interpretations of the Dharma, earlier interpretations of the teaching suit people of lower spiritual development, but this does not mean that they are illegitimate. So the interpretable meaning can be retained as a provisional or auxiliary interpretation on the way to a fuller understanding. So this does not mean that we have to get rid of these earlier interpretations, but we have to be mindful of the fact that they're actually subordinate to a level of development that you find fully expressed in Tsongkhapa's own text. Now, if we bring these two texts together, I haven't really read the text, I've been kind of summarizing it. The juxtaposition of, I will read now the last few paragraphs, the juxtaposition of these two modes of hermeneutic practice underscores the pressing need of these two traditions to develop a strategy affirming the cogency and inner consistency of their own speculative and spiritual trajectories, despite significant instances of development within the tradition. The Christian tradition, receiving its texts from Judaism and building a new and expanded canon, faced the challenge of reconciling Old Testament monotheism and New Testament incarnational theology. Similarly, the Buddhist tradition had to account for the significantly different interpretation of the teaching of Nirvana in the older tradition and in Vajrayana Buddhism. So the supersessionism embraced by the Church Fathers and the distinction between Neyartha and Nitartha ensure that earlier stages in the tradition retain a validity or legitimacy, even if as they are subordinated to more recent historical developments. This hermeneutic standpoint is the glue of a textual canon that would otherwise collapse under the weight of irreconcilable theoretical viewpoints. Now, these obvious methodological parallelisms should not conceal the fact that there are a number of tensions between the traditions. You know, the Christian notion of salvation functions in a linear way as a forward-moving trajectory, whereas the different schools of Buddhism don't really ask questions about creation or eschatology, and they just focus on the question of awakening. So the coming of the Buddha does not accomplish an ontological change in the universe, it just reveals something which is already present. On one hand, the Christological character of Christian supersessionism entails, of course, that spiritual practice takes the form of an imitation of Christ. On the other hand, the reality of emptiness that undergirds the Buddhist notion of nirvana entails that even whenever you have a very high understanding of what the Buddha is doing, the goal of practice is still an awakening into a fundamental emptiness. Perhaps the real fundamental difference is that the notion of upaya kaushalya is actually able to grant a higher degree of legitimacy to earlier interpretations of the Dharma than the classical supersessionist understanding of the early fathers. Because there is a dimension within Maximus and his peers that envisages earlier teachings as really no longer tenable. It's not just that they are not for people of lower spiritual development, but they're just really no longer tenable. Now, to conclude, this conversation between two different traditions, plural, also casts light on the relationship between sacred texts and spiritual practice. It is interesting that Maximus should so forcefully downplay the moral dimension of Scripture to the point of claiming that the fixation with the ethical injunctions of the texts prevents one from realizing its actual transformative import. On one hand, this dovetails with Tsongkhapa's tendency to affirm the conventional character of ethical practice and its subordination to the achievement of awakening. On the other hand, in the Christian tradition, moral rules per se are not viewed as merely conventional. And rather, the issue at stake is rather the danger that they should obfuscate the Christological dimension of the text. So I thought that Tsongkhapa would have perhaps agreed with some words by Maximus included in the Philokalia. And compared with knowledge here, all spiritual knowledge in this world is an indistinct image. It contains a reflection of the truth, but not the truth itself as it is destined to be revealed. Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing that.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cattoi. Again, you have provoked many a thought in my head. But before I share any, what I'd like to say is we now have about 30 minutes for discussion. Julie Welsh, who is the behind the scenes director of really this entire conference, she has given an extra 15 minutes to this particular Zoom meeting. So once the question and answers have ended in a formal way, you are welcome to continue discussion for 15 minutes longer on your own. So you can look forward to that. Before we get into the question and answers, I do want to ask you to please fill out the evaluation form. This is very important for planning for the next Sacred Text Conference. And so if you would please give a few minutes, just a few minutes to filling that out, we at Nazareth would be most grateful. And if you look at the chat, you will see that Julie has sent the link to that. In terms of the question answer, I invite you to unmute and ask directly if you would like. Otherwise, please feel free to put your questions in the chat chat. And Dr. Timani and Dr. Cattoi, I'm happy to either curate those questions for you, or you are also free to look at them and engage them yourselves. I don't want to be heavy-handed here. Do you have a preference? Either.
Maybe it's better if you do that so that we
Sure.
just have someone who directs the conversation.
Yes. Good. I'm happy to do that. I just didn't want to be heavy-handed. So we are open for conversation. And I can't see your full name here. Is it Sterling? Dr. Sandra Sterling?
Yeah, that's Dr. Sandra Sterling Epstein, yes.
Okay.
So I have a question for Dr. Timani. And the question is, could you speak a little bit to the integration of the actual practice with the spiritual and the mystical? So you were saying a lot of things that resonate very clearly for me as an observant and academic Jew. He who kills one is as if he's killed another world. If he saves another world. Everything begins and ends with God, all of that. And in Jewish practice and in Jewish mysticism, the notion is that reaching higher is basically facilitated by doing deeds. So for example, the 5 pillars of Islam, I often speak with my Muslim colleagues about tzedakah, and I know I'm not going to say it right, sadaqah, the Arabic, iteration of that, and so many other things that are part of our life, which give us very clear ways to lessen the self, the hubris, and become part of the whole, and not worry about the power of the whole, but how we're all integrated.
Okay, so you're asking about the practice. What do Muslims do in order to achieve?
Well, how does that integrate with what you're talking about?
Okay, well, you have to, again, I can see, so you have the mystics or the Sufis who literally practice this fana, the annihilation. And Sufis, they go through techniques and meditation, chanting, they sit in a groups, and they say, okay, we experience this fana on a daily basis when we don't feel this existence. So again, they have to go through it's a training, learning, where you have students and then you have teachers, and it's called orders. You have orders. So Sufis believe that this can be achieved before death, because for others that this fana is achieved after death, which means there's no existence and there is no reality except God. Now, if you want to talk about the mainstream Islam, Orthodox Islam, this idea of al-Fana, I don't want to say is practiced by Muslim, but this is what the teaching in the Quran is, to practice al-Fana on a daily basis. When you avoid extremes in whatever you do in life, avoid extremes, pursue moderation. Moderation, which means that this is how you achieve peace, inner peace. So again, annihilation of the self, the annihilation of the ego, to be one with everything. This is when you pursue this peace and harmony in life. And this can be achieved by rejecting extremes and pursuing moderation. So this is the main theme in the text in the Quran, is to have peace, not only with your neighbor, not only with other human being, not only with nature, but within yourself. When you focus on God, when the goal is that reality. And you have so many verses in the Quran that will point us to this idea that there is nothing except one reality, which means we have to destroy all these barriers between us and the other. The other could be nature, could be neighbor, could be anyone. One example verse in the Quran I can think of is that it says, كل شيء فاني ولن يبقى إلا وجه الله, which means everything will be annihilated except the face of God. All right, so what does this mean in the Quran? Of course, you have many interpretations, but for many Muslims who are not Sufis, they take this as rejecting extremes, rejecting the ego, and working with others. And when the self becomes one with the other, so when there is only one existence. All right, so it's all right. So when you have Muslims now following the Quran, and many of them they take, well, again, you have 1.7 billion Muslims, and you have 1.7 billion interpretation of the Quran. But I want to give you my interpretation as I see it, how Sufis and Ibn Arabi is that all these examples in the Quran, they point to one thing, is the annihilation of the ego, the annihilation of the barriers between myself and the other, and we all become one reality or one humanity. So the focus is on one thing, is to help each other and to work with the other. And how do you do that is by pursuing moderation, destroying or rejecting all extremes. 5 pillars could be one, yes, when Muslims pray 5 times a day. Or again, one of the pillars is to pray 5 times a day, and then to pursue zakat or the charity tax, to pay, to help, again, donate, and to say there's no God but God. Again, there's no God but God, which means there is nothing but one reality, and that would reflect on us. All right, so it's a good question, and you can answer that question from many angles and many perspectives.
Thank you, Dr. Timani. Reverend Dr. Jason, I hope I pronounced this correctly, Okrasinski?
That was perfect. Thank you.
Great. You are welcome.
So first of all, I want to thank you both, because my brain feels like a pinball from both your presentations, because there's a lot of overlap. So I'm a Protestant Christian, and a big part of my project is that in Western philosophy, particularly in Kantian Western philosophy, I think Protestant evangelicalism, which picks up the concepts from Luther and Calvin of word alone, faith alone, grace alone, gets distorted, because in Luther, faith alone and grace alone are mystical categories, and overtly influenced Meister, Eckhart, along with Tauler and the German mysticism, are significant sources for Luther. And I don't know that he had, I don't think he had any, why am I spacing? Thomas, who are you just talking about?
Influence, but
I don't think he had the texts of
the Philokalia, no, because that was published later. No, but he did know, I mean, about some of the church fathers, yes, he did know. Like,
yeah. So but I'm seeing overlap, because his doctrine of Scripture is, for Luther, there's an essential mystical piece that overlaps with your presentation. And in fact, I had a quote yesterday about Luther saying, the Christian lives in Christ through faith and in his neighbor in love. In faith, he's caught up beyond himself into God, but by love, he descends beneath himself into his neighbor. I mean, I think he's referencing Meister Eckhart with that quote. So I'm just curious for both of you, there's themes in both of your work about how what we would call the egoic self is kind of dissolved in divine love and then transformed. And that's a major theme in what I see in both Luther and Calvin. But I'm wondering if both of you can speak, are there analogs in your thinkers? Luther's, for example, medieval, so he doesn't have a modern concept of the me, even though he talks about how the word dissolves this. He talks about the self turned inward, getting turned outward by grace in the encounter with love and God. So I'm wondering if either of you, it'd be helpful to me, because I can connect Luther right up with your mystical interreligious projects, but it'd be helpful for me if you could respond to what the analog for the self and its mystical transformation are in the thinkers and texts you're looking at.
Can I say something? So, okay, I could go in many different directions. Thank you for your question. The point is that, okay, what's the point of reading a sacred text to these people? The point of reading a sacred text is not just to get information. That's really like the really, really basic level. But there is a lot more than that. And the point of reading the sacred text is to engage in a sort of trajectory of transformation. That's the point. The text is supposed to be transformative. And that's really what sets apart the sacred text from any other texts. Because the other texts can give you a lot of information, but only this text is actually going to give you the spiritual transformation that you need. The point is that different religious traditions are going to conceptualize religious transformation in a different way because they're going to have different goals. See, so Maximus and Origen think that the goal is to become more like Christ. So you develop a Christological hermeneutics for a particular text. And I don't think that this is incompatible with the Reformed tradition in a sense, because it's not that, I really come from a very different background. But
dovetailing with what you're describing in a way that I think modernity loses. That would be my
point. Is that if you just believe in the historical critical method exclusively, you kind of undercut the possibility of even doing lectiodivina at all, it runs the danger of being really impoverishing, you see. Whereas, in the Buddhist tradition, obviously the goal is going to be very different. The goal is going to be awakened to achieve an insight into emptiness, which, by the way, is not nothingness. So you have just different spiritual trajectories that sort of function as the structure underneath lectiodivina. And well, obviously Luther didn't even know that Buddhism existed.
Right.
But if you just limit the conversation to sort of the Christian side of the story here, I don't think that he would have necessarily have disagreed very much with a lot of what Maximus was actually saying.
I'm struck. I think law and gospel, we read them with a modern anthropology, but they're really quite mystical categories, which can seem inconsistent, but they're almost experiential, because for Luther, the same text that's law that feels attacking, judging one day can be what resurrects and fills you with God the next day. So it really is a mystical.
Because at a different point in your life, you will actually read the text in a different way and actually get a different meaning. And you progress to keep getting new meanings. So it's not that, now I've understood perfectly what this text means and that's it. So it never works like that, because you're always progressing. So the text sort of grows with you. Then Professor Timani maybe has something else to add here.
Yeah, let me just, again, you mentioned about Martin Luther and by faith alone. This is Christianity, faith alone without deeds. Yes, if you ask me now about Martin Luther, I would say he was a Sufi, because that's what the mystics in Islam and Ibn Arabi is about. So Sufis are called the Sufi-minded people, as opposed to mainstream Muslims who are not mystics. They are called the Sharia-minded. Sharia, Islamic law, which means they follow the law literally, and they cannot really offer their own interpretation of it. So this is the law and you have to follow it. So again, in Islam, there is no pope, but the laws serve as the pope, is that if you break the law, then deeds count, Sharia law. For Sufis, they say no, it's faith, Sufi, which means it's the interpretation of the Quran, and the interpretation is not literal. The interpretation is it's the esoteric. It's the hidden meaning. So they try to pursue Sufism based on the Quran, but it's the hidden meaning. So for a Sufi person, and Sufism is again transcends Shiism and Sunnism, where there is less emphasis on deeds and rituals. It's more more on spiritual, heartfelt reach to God. But of course, now the Quran, something that they will use to make their case and to support their interpretation. What they do is that by providing the esoteric interpretation. So faith alone is that's what's important. Sharia, the Sharia law, the rituals are not really important, and that's how in Sufism, this idea of hell and heaven, they don't make sense. God as someone who is watching, and so all these are you find them in the Sharia law, that emphasis on deeds, emphasis on actions. Sufis do not really pursue that. It's about just what you believe and what you experience. So God is experienced in Sufism, whereas in mainstream Islam, God is worshipped. In mainstream Islam, God is feared. In Sufism, God is loved. God should be loved. All right, so again, that's what I see how Martin Luther, you mentioned that based on faith, which means he focused more on this spiritual approach to God.
Yeah,
Thank you very much. This could be a lively topic for the last 15 minutes as well. Let's move, please, to Dr. Andrei Krawchuk. I hope I pronounced that correctly.
Yes, you have. Thank you. Professor Timani, thank you. Actually, thank you both so much for your excellent presentations. Professor Timani, question first to you and a connected question to Professor Cattoi. I'm really struggling in my own reflection with this notion of the annihilation of the self. And of course, I appreciate that you're situating it in the context of, pardon my voice, of moderation, of personal moral responsibility, the fact that all humans are one in their humanity. All of these qualifiers are very meaningful and important. And yet, I personally, when I hear this term annihilation, it strikes me as a very strong term. And I'm wondering if you could help me with that struggle and answer, maybe I would phrase the question in this way, whether there's any other term or a synonym, you know, that might be able to capture, or a reason why one has to keep coming, why is that term necessary? Maybe that would be the way that I would phrase the question. And then to Professor Cattoi, the opposite of that, in the authors that you cite, Maximus, Origen, Tsongkhapa, and you referred to the unselfing and the decentering of the self as a more maybe moderate expression of this same notion that we had in Islam. I'm wondering if there is a point at which there would be a more emphatic embrace of the oneness of all things that would constitute a kind of bridge with the discourse presented by Professor Timani. I found that your discourse is one that I can resonate with, but that's only me. I'm wondering if, you know, from the Buddhist perspectives and so on, that we whether there is a more emphatic embrace of the oneness that one could speak of. Yeah.
All right. Yeah, let me start with your question about the term annihilation. And nice to see you again, Andre. All right. Yeah, so again, it's hard to translate some terms in Arabic that when you give them English words, I don't know if they capture the exact meaning. But al-Fana in Arabic, as it's mentioned in Ibn Arabi, it means the passing away in God, or the passing away in some, which means to cease from existence, to not exist anymore. Because his idea is that it's not that the annihilation in God, which means as if a moth goes through the fire, it becomes the fire. He said we don't become God. He's talking about al-Fana the passing away, which means everything, there's nothing except God. So there is no existence except that one reality. So the term al-Fana could be, again, passing away, annihilation. I'm not really, I don't like that term, annihilation. But what, again, it's similar to nirvana in Buddhism, that you cannot explain, which means this diversity does not exist. And this is the idea of the annihilation or fana, is when you don't see that existence, when you are blind to that existence, and when you see only the reality, that God, which means there's only one God. So really the term al-Fana means there's nothing except God. And so this is his idea, and I see it in Eckhart too. And then when I talk about how do we apply this in our world today, is when we pursue moderation. Maybe Ibn Arabi doesn't have that in his mind, but this is how I can translate that to our world, is that when you destroy all these things that will keep us apart, when again, diversity, yes, it's great, diversity is great, but how to bring this diversity into the one? So again, al-Fana of the things, of the inadequacies, as Eckhart said, that all these inadequacies will be eradicated, which means the ego, the boasting about ourselves, and then we acknowledge that we have one common thing in our humanity. So I don't know if I answered the question, but this is the best I can do.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
And the fact is, in the early Christian tradition, in these authors, you can never really talk about, let's say, the complete erasure of the self, except perhaps if you read Evagrius Ponticus and some of these sort of weird Gnostic authors that don't get into the Philokalia. But if you just think about the mainstream, let's say, the mainstream talks about the purification of the self, or the reordering of the self, or the fact that the inner life of the individual is scattered or disordered because the passions are kind of drawing you into all sorts of different directions. So the point of spiritual practice is never to eliminate the self, but to reorganize the self or reconfigure the self in such a way that the passions are then subordinate to the intellect, and then the intellect can actually use the passions to progress. It's not that you eliminate the passions completely, but you purify them, and they can become the roots of your own virtues. And so the self always remains there. The point about decentering the self is that, because of pride, we think we are the center of the universe, and we no longer understand that we are in a relationship of subordination to God, and we are also in a relationship of communion with others, and you don't want that because you want to be the center of the world and you want to control everything. But the goal of spiritual practice is actually to find your place in this web of relationality that unites you with everybody else in this world and subordinates you to God. So that's the point. But the self always remains there. Then obviously the Buddhists are not going to agree with that at all, because they're going to say that thinking that you have a self is the fundamental mistake, and that you should not you should really understand that you ultimately don't have a self. Although, and that's probably what is interesting about Tsongkhapa. Tsongkhapa says, well, actually, how do you actually figure out that you don't have a self? It's because you have a conventional self that helps you on the way. So the conventional self is there to help you, like, practice the virtues and be moral, and in a way, it's actually a tool. But the mistake is to think that this conventional self is actually something you keep, because ultimately you don't have a self. So it's subtle, but there are echoes between the two traditions, but it's not the same. You really cannot argue that they are saying the same, because the anthropology underneath is really very different.
Thank you.
I want to add regarding that idea of al-Fana. So what Ibn Arabi is saying, exactly what in Christianity, the Trinity. So the Trinity, you have three, but it's one. So Ibn Arabi said we have this multiplicity, the whole world, but again, it's one. So again, this is, if I want to simplify Ibn Arabi, is that we don't have this, again, we see it, but at the end, it's one. Exactly when, Christians say, okay, how do you explain that 3 equal 1? They say, well, 3, but it's 1 at the end. So this is the meaning of al-Fana, which means you bring all this multiplicity into one thing, one being.
Thank you. Dr. Christian Van Gorder.
I'm looking forward, Dr. Timani, to your book on this topic.
Oh boy, okay.
Spend a few hours reading it, and I echo Dr. Krawczuk's comments that when I'm listening to Dr. Cattoi, I'm hearing about progress and a gentle progression as opposed to annihilation. And I'm actually have had this challenge in teaching this to students from a Christian background, because our ontology is this emphasis of sin, which the definition of sin is so different in Christianity and Islam that when you talk about the purification or annihilation, you're talking about two really different things. And then and just even as recent as your mention of the Trinity, the triune nature of God, say not three, Trinitas, say not three, but the triune nature of God, because of the Christian doctrine of the incarnation, then we have a completely different understanding of then what that's even conceivably possible. So I think this is a fascinating, we could have the whole conference on this topic of Fana, because it really does speak to a fundamental inner multi-faith discussion, because I think annihilation is the word that we have with my colleague Fariba Dabra-Damesh and I, we're using that term in our presentation at 1 o'clock. So that is the term and the translated term, but from the Christian-oriented background, as you know, that term is so problematic. And
right.
That was why it was interesting to see Meister Eckhart being used in that capacity, because I don't believe he ever uses the term. And that's my question specifically. Does Eckhart actually use the term annihilation? I think it's a really important point to stress.
That's right. No, I haven't studied Eckhart in depth, but he doesn't come up with the term, absolutely. But the way he explained things, that they are one, this is what I see. I see that related to Ibn Arabi, and then Ibn Arabi talks about al-Fana. So, but yeah, Eckhart doesn't bring that term. And you mentioned about, so you said, again, annihilation is problematic in Christianity and probably in Islam too. But for some Sufis, what they mean by al-Fana, which means the world is always in progression. So what existed just a few minutes ago, they are gone, annihilated, and now we are in new existence, and that's how it continues. Whereas you have some other Sufis, they say, well, what existed before, it's there, remains, and we build on top of it. But for the Sufis, that what existed a minute ago or a second ago is gone, is not there anymore. And then we continue, there is a new existence. But how is it now that annihilation of things before and continue, this is the movement toward perfection. So you keep moving toward perfection. So annihilation and progression and renewal, and every minute will come, if you are a Sufi, you are moving upward toward that perfection where there is only one reality. So that becomes more philosophical now, where you have Muslim philosophers expanded on this idea that there is one reality, and how to, what happens, again, how to achieve happiness and perfection is when you just move upward toward perfection, and everything in the past is annihilated, which means all the imperfections are annihilated. So again, you can put it this way, progression toward perfection.
Thank you. Dr. Cattoi, do you wish to get in there? before we go on? I'm just curious.
No, 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 I think I'm fine.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, very good. Then let's move on to Dr. Hasna. Or I'm not sure I put the
Dr. Islam, I'm
proper
sorry.
place.
It's Dr. Islam. They can call me Zakia.
Okay, Zakia.
Two excellent, beautiful presentation. I mean, my brain is swirling. The Annihilation, I found that especially mainstream Christians have a very difficult time with it. And what Dr. Timani said about passing away probably is passing into God. And like Dr. Timani, I found Eckhart to be so much Ibn Arabi. Literally, he was like the Christian version of Ibn Arabi. That's what I found him to be. And even though again, my depth of knowledge is not that much, even though he may not have used the term, but the way he goes about it, you can see it there.
Are you referring to Eckhart?
Eckhart, yes. Although the term, I didn't come across it, but
that's right.
Every time I read it, I felt that he was taking us there. He was taking us there. Even the concept of the desert, the way he uses it, and it's almost like he's taking us there. It's something, semantics is something, it's very hard to overcome, but I find Buddhism, I'm talking to Dr. Cattoi now, Buddhism helped me when I ventured into the mystical realm. I don't call it Sufism because of all the baggage it has accumulated. I call it Muslim mysticism. So when I ventured into Marifah or Muslim mysticism, Buddhism actually helped me progress, actually. People may think I'm filtering it through Islam, but I tend to think, no, that was the original message. And throughout the ages, just what Muslims are doing to our message as well. We have it in every faith. Because, the awakening is what is in the Quran. And Dr. Timani, you may be able to quote, because there's ayat, which I know more in translation, that Arabic is not coming. When the eyes become keen, means we wake up. The eyes become keener. So we wake up, actually. So the awakening is when we are transformed, or rather when we are annihilated, the fana, which is very hard for other traditions to kind of fathom, we are actually waking up. We are waking up to our true self, because the whole idea is going deep into the nothing but God space, which is all creation is disappearing. Now, when I say I don't believe in heaven and hell, Muslims have a very hard time with me, because then I'm slowly trying to phrase something that I can convey to them, that heaven and hell is relative to creation. Like if you're in the creation, yes, that may make sense, because it's the stick and the carrot thing for the laws. So one has to follow the laws, and eventually you see that all these laws of creation. But if we are at the space of Tawheed, which is the crux of Islam, nothing else but God, then those things disappear, the meanings disappear. And so decentering that Maximus Dr. Cattoi spoke of, I felt I couldn't relate to that, because I felt that it's so much of a Western thing that's coming there. It's like the self, it's more of the higher self. We are going to our higher self. We are actually more into the self that is the truth. And we are the raft, the boat that Buddhism speaks of, we are leaving that raft. We don't need that tool because Nirvana is always there. So we don't need that tool. Buddhism to me is completely Marifah. And it's like, oh my God, that opened up Marifah for me. So I felt that the Quranic ayat that says, God is saying that I created all religions so that you know, so that you understand. So basically I find that all the traditions are helping me to understand my tradition, and I feel all the traditions can use other tradition to get deeper into their own tradition. That's my general feeling after how I got help through Hinduism, Buddhism, and Christianity. I couldn't go very deeply into Judaism as such, and I feel I really should. I wish there was more time in my life. But that's what I felt I can point out to. And so there's something else.
Yeah, just want to speak about, you mentioned the transformation. This idea that is in the Quran to transform the self, the awakening.
Awakening.
Yes, so it's about annihilation of whatever we had before, the passing away, and then the remaining. So again, Ibn Arabi talks about passing away, but remaining in God. There is remaining somewhere.
Awakening to God.
That's right. It doesn't mean complete annihilation. It doesn't mean non-existence. It's that being transformed from something to something, passing away here, but remaining there. So again, the terms in Arabic, fana and baqa, passing away.
Right. Yeah.
So transformation, this is where the Quran, and you have many verses relating to that. Of course, now the Sufis, the mystics, they talk about that it means annihilation. It means, so for example, the verse in the Quran where God said, I give you life, I give you death, and I give you life again. And mainstream Muslims, they take it literally that God created us, he gave us life, and then we'll die, and then he will give us life again in heaven or eternity on Judgment Day. But the mystics, the Sufis, they say, no, this is about transformation and passing away and remaining, and they talk about reincarnation. So you have Muslim sects in the Middle East, like the Druze in Lebanon and Syria. They believe in the incarnation, which means the soul is all, again, life and death until reaching perfection. And then no more of this birth and death. So this is annihilation of the imperfection and moving toward perfection until you don't really, you're not in this life anymore. You are one with God, and the soul is the ultimate happiness. So again, transformation is the key here. This is the awakening. And if you realize that, now you are able to achieve it. And yeah, thank you for bringing that.
Thank you. Thank you.
I will just jump in for a minute to bring this to a formal close, and so you can embrace the informal conversation. I don't want us to miss the fact that we have been doing beautifully and deeply and critically and openly what people around the world today feel is not possible, which is to bring our differences together, to put out our understandings and our hopes and our beliefs, and to hear them through ears different than our own in ways that open us to what we did not even know was there within our own traditions, and that become amplified because of this intersectionality, if you will, with other traditions. And so for me, this hour and a half has been a sign of the way, more than a sign, it has been the actual doing of how religion can contribute to the change of human relationship, to bond us, to open us, to help us to excel to the best of what we envision for ourselves. So I invite you to continue the conversation, but I also thank you for the privilege of being part of this discussion.
Thank
Susan,
you so much.
I just want to add one thing to what you just said, which is really important. It's one of the most important statements I've ever heard in my life of experiences in these kinds of settings. A few years ago at this very conference, one of our keynoters made a really important point, and I think it's a very critical footnote to what you just said. And what she said was, this is incredible. And we also have to understand that if all of us are not feeling just a tiny bit uncomfortable at some points, then we are not doing our job. In other words, this is not a kumbaya kind of thing. This is a, guys, we're getting real, and these are points of difference. And I years ago, I was in Montreal, and we went up that mountain, and there were many different paths, and everybody ended up at the same point. And I feel like that's what this is. We're all on our path, and I'm not convincing Zakia to go on my path, and Anastasia's not convincing me to go on hers. What is so significant is that we go on our individual paths, understand that we're all doing the same thing. And as Zakia, my friend Nora Aswali said, don't accuse, don't assume, ask questions.
Yes, absolutely. And that's one of the things that I found so strong here was critical scholarship, if you'll allow me to use that term, was very much at play, but it's not divisive. It's an opening. And so I'm so grateful, Sandra, that you clarified that, because I'm not talking about this homogenation into a kumbaya moment. What I loved was it was an hour and a half of hearing people come from their own traditions, but also being willing to be very clear about the way in which the learning transformed their own understanding of their tradition and their scholarship and their living of that tradition. For me, there's tremendous hope in that. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And please continue as much as your schedules will allow you to do so.
Yeah, thank you. I need to leave because I have to go to another meeting, but thank you all very much, and thank you for sharing. Thank you.
Thomas, you leave me alone.
I think you can handle it.
That's right. Hopefully. And I, again, if you want to stay in touch with me if you have any questions or suggestions, or again, your critique of my paper, because I want to work more on that. I've been engaged in interfaith dialogue, and I've been publishing about how to, again, bring or create interfaith theology, but mainly it was about the Quran and bringing verses from here and there and how to make them compatible with Christianity and the nature of God. But I haven't worked on how to create interfaith theology based on the mystical traditions of religions. So I started doing this, and I hope I can continue, and others continue with that, because we don't see people working on interfaith dialogue using the mystical traditions. And of course, I want to bring Judaism to my study also, because definitely that's how Muslim mystics were inspired by Christian mystics, by Jewish mystics. So this whole enterprise really, it's all together, especially when we talk about Abrahamic traditions. And why is it important in Judaism, Christianity, Islam? Because we don't focus on that, as opposed to Eastern traditions. Eastern traditions, they are mystical anyway. But in Abrahamic traditions, mystical traditions are shunned, they are rejected, and we wanna bring them into the discussion, and we wanna again discuss them and see what we can do with mysticism.
Also, Dr. Timani, as you're speaking, what occurs to me is I'm a teacher of text. I teach Jewish texts in all kinds of settings to all kinds of ages, from scholarly all the way to my cute little kids who have great wisdom, and I end up using them to teach adults. And one of the things that I note continually is that the notion of reaching higher and reaching outward can be very, very scary to people. And one of the points that I always make is whenever I give the teacher, I always have taught people, always ask, when did they live? What was going on? Why were they teaching what they were teaching at the time? And what was their agenda? And one of the things I've noticed is this incredible correlation between historical disasters and this ground swelling of mystical thinking and theology and all of that. And I think a lot of it is because people were just, excuse the use of the word, mystified by how off-centered everybody was, and using, as you spoke at the beginning, religion to blame everybody for the problems. And I think that this study is so important at this point in time for this same reason, because I think we can all agree that our world is, as my one daughter would call it, one hot mess.
True, you're right. Thank you for that.
Could I just add one thing, Dr. Jason Okrinsky, I'm probably always pronouncing it wrong, do forgive me. You're the one who talked about the Lutheran perspective, and you're seeing Lutheran, right? Okay. It seems like I had a similar journey. When I ventured into the mystical realm, everything I read, no matter from what tradition, I could see the beauty and the truth and the mystical beauty in it. So I am wondering if you are at a parallel journey in your own tradition, where whatever you read is because because I do believe these figures, if we are not seeing their mysticism, then we are not reading them right. I don't know why I think that, but I think that anybody worth reading is ultimately a mystic, and we fail to see it because of our own limitations. And the question about faith alone, you see, in Islam, and Dr. Timani, correct me if I'm wrong, the springboard is faith. We have to start from the point of faith of there's nothing but God, Tawheed. But of course, we go through this whole thing of completely becoming idolatrous about the exoteric Sharia path, which we always have to observe, because that's the structure for this, as long as we're living in this world. That is a structure we have to adhere to. But then we are supposed to go into the path of transformation and not think that is the end all of everything. But we have the majority of Muslims who will, go, oh, if you don't do that, you'll go to hell, and so on and so forth, which is problematic. No, it's there for the exercise of the soul, and we should all, as long as we're living in this structure of a world, we have to do that. That never goes away. But not to see beyond that, of course, is the problem. So the faith only for Luther, probably, I don't know. Again, I'm filtering it from my own mystical lenses, although whatever I've learned so far, so much more to go, is that is a very strong springboard for anything. So, and he, of course, says the 5 things I forgot, sola, this, sola, that, and there's one of them is the scriptures, the book alone, and so on. I don't know, am I making any sense to what you are thinking?
You are. Let me speak personally and name that there is certainly a deep, abiding, primary existential journey that for me begins not with Luther, but with Jesus.
Who?
That said, I, choosing to become a Luther scholar at PhD level, there's famously with Luther, there's like 2 Luthers, because there's like this cranky, angry Luther. He said anti-Islamic things, anti-Semitic things. They're exhausting. But then there's this other Luther, the Luther of the preacher, the Luther of the gospel, the Luther who people reported showed up with his parishioners, who's love, grace, and he is a mystic. So there's a way that as both a Christian, but also as a scholar, he's engaging. Specifically, though, then within Luther research in the last 20 years, there has been, it started as a project of interdialogue between Lutherans and Eastern Orthodox Christians, in which really good scholarship started to name as an academic influence. Luther has this deep mysticism, and there, by the way, is some in Calvin too. It's not as particular and pronounced, but where things get really passionate for me as a scholar is that, from the American standpoint, the Reformation leads to the religious wars, leads to the Enlightenment. The Spanish conquistadors in Florida are part of this. Immanuel Kant is particularly influenced by Luther's critical dialogue with reason. there are connections with colonial whiteness. There are connections with the way that even white nationalist evangelicals, the depravity in their spirituality has led to this vapid nihilism that we saw in the Capitol. So I confess, Luther is a loaded cauldron in his intellectual influence, but that's also the passion that the Jesus who frees and resurrects me on a daily basis is at least in part the Jesus that motivates Luther. But then as a medieval politician, he's a cranky anti-Semitic monster. And so, you know, there's a piece of wanting to say, well, he looks like the worst of Western civilization at times, and yet he describes personally and with my parishioners, when my progressive parishioners on one breath want to be Christians and mystics, and yet they're scared of reading their scriptures. Well, they've inherited this legacy that starts with Luther and gets confused in Western, you know, and often it's not the church. I mean, this is one of the things. The church, there's actually a book about how when whiteness first kind of starts to get constructed as a race making, the evangelical Protestant theologians and Bible scholars are the ones who say we can't do this. Genesis tells us we are one people. It's the banks, it's those who want to profit in America who really start saying no. And of course, as is often the case, and I'm not overly excusing religion, but there are some scholars who slip and start to say, you know, they pick up the mark of Ham is the first place where they start to go, well, maybe black and brown bodies it's an ugly theology, but the influence of money comes before the bad exegesis comes. And so, you know, Luther's not responsible for that, but his legacy's all over all of the way that scripture gets used epistemologically. And I guess the final note is what drives me nuts is it's only a poor reading of Luther that puts that in him. He has a more mystical, there's actually a famous article about, I'm looking at you, Dr. Epstein, that compares Luther's hermeneutics to rabbinic hermeneutics, that it's not what's on the page for Luther, it's what the community does when they read it. And what Luther's giving is he's trying to give safety rails so that it is grace and liberation and resurrection, but there's slips in the way that gets translated. So that was a big answer, both the personal and the professional, but I very much appreciated the question. And this was one of the most invigorating panels I've been a part of. So thank you, everyone.
I think also, just very quickly, since you brought it up, that the issue of Luther is also what he was reacting to. You have to put it into its context. It's like in the Jewish community, people get really angry when they hear that I use text from the New Testament. They say, how can you do that? Jesus hated the Jews. Well, if you look at what Jesus was saying about the Pharisees and what they were doing, first of all, the prophets are saying the same thing. They haven't learned, and it's not untrue. So sometimes it's a little bit of a mirror of looking at the worst of ourselves too. And anytime a new religious theology or iteration of that theology comes on the table, we can parallel that and have the same conversation about the beginning of what we know as the ideological movements in the Jewish community that began around 1815 or so. So yeah, I think you're right. I mean, it's going back to, you know, are we looking at what we're looking at literally, or are we looking at more of the meaning and trying to understand what their context is and asking where that is coming from?
Well, I'm struck that saying Jesus hates Jews is like saying Luther hates Catholic. Luther's a Catholic, Jesus is Jewish. Right, and they don't, there's not a self-hatred thing, there's a criticism from, right? I mean, there's an analog there.
Exactly.
I think too, I'm struck, one of the key things I struggle with practically as a practical theologian is people read Luther like he's a liberal modern Westerner, but he's a medieval Augustinian monk, and he's a mystic. So, you know, again, Zacchaeus, to your question, I think Luther is primarily a mystic, but he's trying to do this academic work of reform. And if you read my paper, you know, the story of him nailing the 95 Theses, historiographically, the scholars no longer believe that happened. There's no evidence it happened. He never references it. It doesn't really get started getting conversation until the last 100 years. And what's more enlightening is that Luther, 10 years before 1517, is lecturing on Galatians and Romans, and he sends his document to the archbishop who's on the take. So that the truth is, he was in conferences, he was reading, he was writing, he was trying to reform in the right ways, and full disclosure, his temperament was a mess. So when the Pope responds negatively, he immediately calls him the Antichrist, and it's over. But I get fired up because there's so many analogs to the crisis, the mess that I think the West and particularly American democracy has to Luther. But read rightly, he offers as many solutions as he does kernels of the problem. So that's what
we have to wrap up, Job. I read Judy's text, so they have to go home and or have to take their break. Dr. Timani, please, I hope you get my email. I really want to keep in touch with you.
Yeah, actually, everyone, if you need to be in touch with me, because I see that some of you send me some text, so please email me, and I'll be more than happy to hear from you. And,
I don't have your email, so I put in my email. And Julie, I won't make it any longer for my part. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you
you,
all very
everyone.
much.
Thank you.
Be blessed.
Thank you.